Next discussion is that all animals are affected this way, and we, as animals, are not immune to that, right? This is how we have gotten to this point, right? With thummy thumbs, okay? Well, maybe not exactly the thummy thumbs, but how we've gotten to this point more so, right? Clearly the thumbs and the primate thing happened first, which probably opened up possibilities for other things also related then to our own brain. So primates overall, and I'll say one big overarching thing about all of this, man, the deck is stacked. Wait, the deck is stacked. That's what I mean. The deck is stacked for primates that we have had some amazing evolutionary advantages above other animal groups leading up to this time before we even got to be Homo sapiens. Just hominids in general, primates, just amazing. Starting with the thumbs and just all of it. It's really cool. Anyway, to back up a little bit, the change during the late Paleogene in the Neogene, as the forests were shrinking and the grasslands were expanding, of course, had a really dramatic effect on our ancestors, right? On the people that we have sometimes a hard time calling people or calling our ancestors. But the relationships that we have much further back in our evolutionary tree in the Hominidae, our overall family, and some of our closest living relatives, the living day primates that are out there today, things like the gorilla, and then the closest living relative sharing somewhere close to 98% of our genetic material is not the bonobo, the chimpanzee. Now going back even before, just shortly after that, shortly after the evolutionary split, when we begin to see, now that we look back in the fossil record, the names that we give, the things like that are the Australopithecines, right? Or Australopithecines, I think, Australopithecines, and maybe there's Africensis and a few others. Here's Anamensis. I wish I was more into physical anthropology, or I wish I studied that stuff a lot more. It is very fascinating to me. I understand deeper paleontology a little bit more in some of these details. But I really like this diagram right here because I think things like this, where there's direct lines that are drawn from one to the other, or even, as I just showed this last one, where we have these direct changes that are going from one to the other. I think that is really, that has helped the population in general to misunderstand the process of evolution, and has necessitated this weird idea of a missing link, is that there always has to be biological or biomorphic transfer or chain or specific species between this one and this one. Anyway, I probably shouldn't go into those arguments and details deeply, but I like this because it does a really good job of showing the error bars that are over here of the length of existence. This is where we know that it existed. We have the fossils from that time period. And then its geographic extent, right? That's kind of what's labeled here more so on the y-axis is the geographic extent. And then, of course, time on this axis. But also, so the time error bars are fairly well shown, or the time of existence, and then also that there's geographic differences, and that there's not direct connections, right? This Australopithecine doesn't evolve into this Australopithecine. They're from two different places, completely different places. They're clearly related, clearly from a common ancestor. We don't know what that common ancestor was. It's not in the rock record. It's not in the fossil record. That's just how preservation works. In some cases, we do know, or probably what the common ancestor was 2 steps ago. Anyway, I think this does a really good job of not showing that there's a direct line of saying humans came from monkeys or something like this, right? This is oftentimes the really absurd statements from a kind of anti-evolutionary perspective of, what do you mean we came from monkeys? Why are they still here? Or where are the fossils in between? Where we today are a widely different species. And what is really shown in evolution is that we have common ancestors between us. Before modern-day chimpanzees ever became modern chimpanzees, or Homo sapiens, Homo at all, ever became Homo, there was a common ancestor between them. And it may not have been one species of common ancestor. It may have been several links up above that are gone before you get back to a common ancestor. Anyway, we're not immune to the changes in the environment during the Neogene. As the forests are shrinking around us, the climate is overall cooling and drying. There are some major environmental changes that are occurring, and one response to that was to go higher up in the mountains, and in the forest. The gorillas seem to have basically taken that niche, the primates, the mountain gorillas. There was another tactic, which was to essentially become marginal plains dwellers. And because of the palate of most primates to be omnivorous, or really, I like to think of myself sometimes as an opportunitarian, right? I certainly will eat food that I buy, and I buy a selected food, but I'm never going to pass up food that somebody offers me, right? Or something that's for free or something like this. I take the opportunities of food that come towards me. And that's an advantage that we have as omnivores, right? Is that we can pretty much eat anything. May not be the best thing for us, may not be the worst thing for us, or whatever. It may not give us that much nutrition, but we can eat a whole variety of things. Maybe sometimes that's our omnivore's dilemma, like in Michael Pollan's book. Anyway, that stomach ability to eat a whole lot of variety of things gave us one of these cards, these secret cards that we have as primates, of an evolutionary advantage to fill in this niche of living on the margins between the canopies, the forests, which we were clearly getting pushed out of. They were also shrinking, so there's more and more primates trying to occupy these same forests. And let me tell you, we just weren't that good at it at that time as the Australopithecines. So we're getting pushed out of a shrinking forest or a shrinking, city-zoned area. And at the same time, the plains are expanding, and there are more and more ungulates that are filling these plains, which are also predated, or they're also the prey of the dominant predators, which are starting to emerge onto these landscapes as well. So though it's a dangerous place, the plains, for any animal, especially if they're not very fast, we're not very fast, it is an area where there can be plenty to pick up after other organisms. So if that lion pride kills, the cave lion or something, it kills an animal, and then there's a kill that's left over, we may be able to get to that later. Or maybe, if an animal like the cat is killed during the chase, we can eat that. In the meantime, we can follow the ungulates around and eat the bugs, maybe, the insects, and larvae that occupy their dung. So we can flip over cow pies and maybe eat some bugs that are growing there, mixed with some herbs or grasses or fruit from the grasses that are growing in the area, or fungi that are growing from either the trees or the woods or the poop or the grass. So we have a very wide diet, and that gave us an advantage to live in such a niche like this. Not that other primates wouldn't have had a similar advantage. That also came with, not only was our stomach primed for that, but also our hands were already primed for being omnivores, right, of having little hands. Look at rats or other omnivores that are out there, raccoons. Grabbing is really important for trying to get whatever food you can and run with it, right? So we have facultative opportunism that was between a few unique factors that gave us this evolutionary advantage in the sort of shrinking forest and expanding grasslands type of environment. And then, that we had this huge takeoff after that. And it is really amazing that there is a whole lot of primate species that follow that general story, right? And we're not the only hominid type of species or hominid primate that was occupying the plains or the deserts or the forests at that time. Here's a book from, I believe this is 2014, Sawyer, edited by Sawyer, The Last Human, a guide to 22 species of extinct humans. So we are just one of 23 other species that were living out there with us and alongside us. So here's some overlapping hominids over the last 250,000 years. You have overlapping Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, Florensis, just before the rise of Homo sapiens. This is a little bit older. I do believe that it's about 300,000 years from what we can figure that maybe this anatomically Homo sapiens were around. Anyway, close to our overlapping, we have Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and Florensis, and Homo erectus that all overlapped in time shortly on the tail of things like Heidelbergensis. So we were overlapping with animals that were very, very similar to us. So these are, I think it's been discussed as things like erectus, Homo erectus. This is just kind of like a barely different looking person walking down the street, that had they had modern clothes, this is always a funny argument, right? But had they had modern clothes and knew what they were doing in the city, they look human, recognizably human, much more human than a chimpanzee, and maybe much less human than you and I do. But there's a recognizable human quality about them. All of those different species that we overlapped with, this is pretty neat. The map down here shows Homo habilis, slightly older, Homo erectus, also occupying the Indonesian archipelago, and even Homo florensis, discovered in I think about 2006, 2004, also in the Indonesian archipelago. Homo florensis, oftentimes called the hobbit humans. Homo florensis was often happens on island nations like Australia, is things either become gigantic or they become tiny, right? Or they become shrunken. And this was a species that dealt with its island-dwelling environment by shrinking. And now this is an artist rendition of a Komodo dragon, and Homo florensis actually hunting a Komodo dragon. This is an artist rendition, of course, and I really honestly don't know how accurate this is at all. But I think it's great imagery, right? And that's probably a mistake to put that in the course. I don't often do stuff like that. But this was just such a great image. I really couldn't pass up using this. But in this artist rendition, what is shown is that the Homo florensis are using tools, they're using weaponry to do organized hunting techniques to attack a high-level carnivore, right? So these are not animals. They probably, would have been able to use it for food, but also attacking high-level carnivores is no small feat, right? People die from that as a result. So I think this is a really interesting artist rendition. I don't know how much archaeology is behind it. So Homo florensis, the hobbit human. Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalis, of course, you ought to be familiar with. This is your typical, what's typically discussed as the caveman, right? Or maybe even, sometimes we think of cavemen as us, which isn't wrong, right? I mean, we, we have our Paleolithic times. But I think more often when we think of the caveman, even if we think we're related to them, what's the clubs, the dragging your hands on the ground and just kind of cavey, was that a good rendition? No, okay, I'll try harder next time. But cavemen, I think, are oftentimes associated with this sort of dumb human animal that was thought to be basically the Neanderthal. Now, what I think is incredibly fascinating about this is that dumb thing, right, is such an understatement to our overall the human qualities that we have had for thousands of years, 250,000 years as our species, or even longer as Neanderthals, that we've had culture for a very long time. We had no time where we these dumb club dragging things. I mean, every animal uses a brain of intelligence, and there was that certainly was the case for Neanderthal. That in recent years it has been we've learned so much about Neanderthals. One, that there's a culture, a very deep burial culture that goes along with Neanderthals. Recently, I read an article that they were even wearing feathers or after raptors and other types of birds for their feathers that they were either wearing or ceremonially using, which is something that we here on this continent, indigenous, were doing in honoring their deities or the animistic view of the world. So is a very culturally relevant thing. So Neanderthals, not only have we learned a lot about their culture and their art, we also have learned in the past couple of decades, thanks to the Human Genome Project out of the 1990s, that we are part Neanderthal. Not we as in like every single one of us are Homo sapiens, but there's also a very large percentage of the European population that have a varying percentage, up to 4%, I think, is close to the maximum amount of genetic code of Neanderthals. My mom did her genetics a couple of years ago, or her DNA test, right? And I know that she has a few percent of Neanderthal DNA. So, of course, I would, and so, of course, Gundi would, right? We're cavemen in a modern-day age. I love that quote, by the way. Maybe we'll get to that another time, discuss that. But so I find that really fascinating, too. There's a region of interbreeding that's been known and discussed where Neanderthals and Homo sapiens would have overlapped. The classic idea is that Homo sapiens found the dumb Neanderthals and killed them all, right? And we forced them to go extinct. Now there's a slightly different understanding and perspective there that maybe anthropologically you can read up on all of that. It's very fascinating. It's very new world, I think, to me, anthropologically, but is very fascinating. So Homo neanderthalis, and then as I mentioned, Homo sapiens with not only our ancestral Australopithecine hominid evolutionary advantage to begin spreading around the world and multiple different types of Homo, but Homo sapiens had effectively the very first of these 23 species to effectively have a type of mobility and maybe even a perseverance. I don't want to get too imbuing them with too many honoring qualities or something, but a need for more, for expanding territories. Whether this was the beginning of population rise, where populations were losing resources and more people had to go to the periphery, whether this was a cultural strive for needing to have certain numbers of bands and people and needing to continually expand, or maybe a cultural adventure of always needing to expand into new lands for adventure or for space or for resources. I think that, again, in the anthropology community, there's wide variety of hypotheses for exactly why this was occurring. Now, why aside, and the how is pretty well discussed, right? We got these great bipedal things here and these great things to make all sorts of equipment with, but what I also find then fascinating is over the last 170,000 years that's depicted here, we have spread circumboreally all over the continent to all of the island nations, making it to Australia fairly quickly, and in the Polynesia and across into Micronesia by the voyagers and across the ocean. All the way along the Pacific Rim, across both by land and by boat. It's now been shown genetically to the Americas. It's genetically known now that people of the Americas actually have multiple generic heritage, which was born on this continent, as they've always told us for thousands of years that they are unique here. They didn't come from anywhere else. They were born here. Is Mongolian DNA or Philippine and Polynesian DNA. Uniquely, the peoples that were migrating in those two paths combined to form the basis of today what is Native American DNA. Now, all right. To back up just a tiny bit is that I've now demonstrated or hopefully shown that climate changes or mass extinctions, any kind of changes in the environment affect life to change. And that also we, as modern day Homo sapiens, were impacted by a very similar process that has made us who we are. It is because environmental change in many different capacities, in the extinction of the dinosaurs, in the expansion of the grasslands, and thumbs, that we find ourselves here today, right on the heels of us spreading around the world like wildfire, and very, very quickly. Now, this number right here is in thousands of years. This is a class where we've talked about billions of years and even millions of years. And millions, up until today, up until now, has been our smallest increment of time that we've usually focused on. Very rarely have we invoked the small unit of thousands. But under 200,000 years, which is a short time period of our modern Homo sapiens species that developed over here in Africa, right? Mother Africa. In less than 200,000 years, we have found ourselves circumboreally all over the world, not just filling the niches of mammals, as we've done through the Paleogene as mammals and the Neogene, but now filling every niche as humans and adding a new anthropogenic component to every environment. So we have successfully really done something different, done something that nobody else has done, right? Or no other animals really have done. There have been circumboreally spread animals, and there are circumboreally spread plants today that can be found on every continent, but really not nearly in the capacity that we have. Now, if you look at human population, the 170, let's go back to this one. The spread out of the Fertile Crescent area has been occurring for quite some time, right? I mean, we have green arrows out here, 15 to 12,000 years by the time we make it to the Americas. I guess the Australian one is a little bit older, making it here to the Thailand 50, 40,000 years ago, up to Europe 50, 40,000 years ago. So the expansion happened quite quickly before the advent of agriculture, okay? Well before people were using modern agricultural techniques. So basically what I mean is we spread around the world before we ever learned how to farm. Homo sapiens are not inherently farmers. We are a form of hunters and gatherers, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Now, 10,000 years ago, however, a brand new type of way to live all of a sudden sprouted on the scene. And this is really fantastic and still a kind of an enigma in our own history, is not all exactly the same time. And these are sometimes offset by a couple thousand years, 4,000 years between the onset of agriculture in, say, Central America and the Fertile Crescent. But my point here is all about around the same time, we have the origin of what we call today agriculture. Multiple origins and spread of agriculture. The spread is in blue. Agriculture is a style of taking seeds or roots or whatever it is from last year's crops and making a field and making it that crop. So say saving rice grains from last year and making that whole field over there rice for next year and then saving some of those. You're familiar with agriculture, right? I believe so. It's our dominant way of living today. And it's not the only way to live, right? I mean, for 290,000 years before the advent of agriculture, we had been living in a different way. We had been doing a whole variety of ways of living. And then here's the spread of that agricultural way of living. So for well over 200,000 years, humans lived in a variety of other ways that unfortunately, because we don't have all of the details and all the data for this, they didn't write cuneiform, they didn't write us papers and essays and have books around for this. They didn't really write on stone tablets even for a very long time until the rise of agriculture. There is not much that we know about the Paleolithic, Neolithic, non-agriculturalist peoples. They left very little of a record, and that would be comparable to today's archaeology of native North America. There's stuff that's here, and it's only 15,000 years old maximum, and it's still hard to really discover and replicate exactly what was going on. So this whole time period of us, we don't know a whole lot about. Now, we invent farming, and then we, of course, have more resources at our fingertips. We have, if somebody is growing all the grain that's out here, who needs to manage the grain that's over here? And who gets to tell, so-and-so how much they get, and how much the priest gets, and how much the medicine person can afford, or about the old people, right? Or the young people, or, so there emerges out of agriculture. Not only do we have the cities beyond villages, but cities or townships, or this way of living in a tighter packed community that's stable, that doesn't have to be nomadic, that doesn't have to follow boundaries, follow game, and whatever was happening here, a whole variety of things. But it's the agriculture and the husbandry, or animal agriculture, plant agriculture and animal agriculture, that really begin to dominate the scene, and we have a lot more record of that. And even that, say ancient Sumeria, the rise of cuneiform writing and the rise of religion, the rise of states, the rise of religious mythologies, slightly predating China, or maybe not even, but that China as well, about 10,000 years ago, the rise of these two things, we begin to see that China changed, right? Everywhere. We made it all over the earth before agriculture, but now these idea seeds that are out there regarding agriculture are now beginning to spread, and those agricultural methods now become the way that we do things. And from earlier agriculture sprouts more industrialized agriculture, naturally, where we get better at doing what we're doing. And from that rises organization and division of labor, laws, economy. And out of that, of course, is the need then for writing and multi-year communication. You need to know how much money is in your bank, right? If you don't have writing, you can't know how much money is in your bank or grain is in your silo. And then from that, of course, the final emergence of settled living. Now, I think I slightly went off of the progression that's here, but I think you really get what I'm getting at too here, is that our lives as hominids, as primates, even as just Homo sapiens, our lives changed tremendously 10,000 years ago, going from a style of living that we know very little about, that was clearly quite successful, at least for the longevity of our species, well over 200,000 years we were doing stuff, before this last 10,000 years, and now pretty much everybody all over the world lives in that one single way. We do agriculture. There's very few indigenous peoples around the world that don't sustain off of agriculture, that do, maybe a style of agroforestry at the most, maybe a style of horticulture, or of a style of permaculture in the Amazon tribes, or even in the modern permacultural movement. But there are very, very, very few people on Earth that are not living in this one way, right? The agriculturalist way. And actually, to even propose anything else or to suggest that there's another way to live is kind of asinine, right? I mean, we need food to live. You have to have a job. You have to to have your job to get money, and then to have that money to pay for food and all the other commodities that we have. It's a given to today's modern life in the last 10,000 years is that we, or even just now, is that we have agriculture. So my point here is just to show that for a long time we were doing something else, but then it occurred to us that that seemed like the only way that humans could actually live, is to make sure that we had control of our food supply, so we no longer lived at the whim of nature for our food supply. We no longer had to see our children starve if we had, a baby over the summer and the food was scarce and maybe that child didn't make it, right? Just because of food scarcity. Or maybe grandmother finally died because of food scarcity. Or maybe many people are starving because of food scarcity. Also, you didn't grow as much because of food abundance, right? If you're living at the whim of nature, there probably were not a baby for every person in the not village, but band or something like that, every time that there was a little bit more food supply. So living, just as like every animal in the entire world lives exactly this way. They either have a slightly higher population because their food source is slightly higher, but as soon as their food source declines, their population declines as well. So no longer in the control of nature, because we can control our own food supply by growing more this year to save for next year, even if it's hard times. And then another thing occurred to us is that when we became farmers, when we became agriculturalists, and we became a community of peoples that lived together in houses, we clearly separated ourselves from the animals. We've now thoroughly convinced ourselves that we are, in some cases, that we are not animals, right? That we think we're not. Some people really know that and refute that at all, that we are even related to the animals, or that we fit under that class of organisms as animals. So clearly, not only today in that perspective, but in a time in our history, right, we have actually elaborate stories that are written about this, or myths that we find in ancient texts or ancient religious texts that are written out of the Fertile Crescent area, is that we are clearly different, or even created differently than the animals were. And then that has also led to the idea that animals, and for the most part, the entire inanimate world, the soils, the rocks, the clouds, the rain, the rivers, the air, all of it seems to have been meant for us, because we're the only ones out here thinking about it. We're the only ones that are out here working the soils for food. We're the only ones who are caring for our young so we can have more and more people filling our village, right? It started to become clear, I would imagine, again, you can't put yourself in the shoes of these people at the time, but in our written records from after these ages, from what we know of people before that, is it becomes very clear that these were things that we set up. I mean, this is one of the first stories that is written in the mythologies of ancient Sumeria, in the epics of Gilgamesh, and then later in stories adapted for the Old Testament in Genesis. And also this is a philosophy that was clearly written in those texts, that animals are not us, and that actually animals are created for us, and that we don't have to be at the control of nature, the whim of nature for our food supply, that we can create our food supply. In fact, the creator of animals, and us differently, mind you, told us that we need to do this, that we can't live like animals and just get food, that we have to work for our food. Now, I know I took a long time to explain that, but I think it's this really interesting point to really show that there was a big change in Homo sapiens 10,000 years ago, and this isn't a morphological change from what we can tell. We didn't change anything about how we look or how we do things, where that's business as usual. When an environment changes, the morphology changes, right? I just went through a long time to show examples of that. But But all of a sudden, we started changing our environment to adapt to us rather than us adapting to the environment. We are making our own environment for us, right? Did you ever notice, like, a car isn't made for a giraffe? My daughter looks at me like I'm crazy. But did you ever notice that? A car isn't made for a giraffe. It's clearly made for us. A building isn't made for a giraffe. A water bottle is not made for a giraffe. Basically, nothing is made for a giraffe unless it's veterinarian equipment or zoo equipment for giraffes, right? So this has been called, I'm not the first, of course, to call it this, and I think it's a really great way to think about this, but about 10,000 years ago, during these 3 points that became so solidly ingrained in our mind, is we forgot that we did anything else but farm, right? And even 15, 30 minutes ago, telling you about just the fact, that we are animals and that we used to do all these other things for 200,000 years, it's really weird and soft for us to even think about because we don't have a good collective memory of that, and we don't have a lot of collective data of what we were doing during that time. So it's a big mystery. Big mystery, 200,000 years. I mean, we know quite a bit about the Paleolithic, but we seem to have collectively forgot that those are our ancestors, that those are the things that we were doing for a very long time. Collectively forgot that those are our ancestors, that those are the things that we were doing for a very long time. And so if you look at human population, post 10,000 years ago, we don't know a whole lot about human population before that. Why? Because we weren't centralized in cities. We have a much better understanding of large populations because they left an impact on the earth, where there were cities and dwellings and these kind of things. Now, again, we know about population, right? We estimate, we have ways that we can tell how large bands were and things like that, but it's larger error bars than on some sort of city or agricultural fields. Now, march through time, and then 4,000 years ago, we began to expand population wider yet, and then getting to the last half of the last millennium, we get to a really large, steep rise in human population. So this, on the other hand, rather than being related to the advent of agriculture, which we took food under our own guise, we put it under lock and key, we made up writing and religion and law to go along with this to figure out how to govern ourselves. And we began to do that really well and then expand that philosophy all over the earth. And then, by the time we got all over the earth and in the Americas, we began to find new energy sources. This whole time, for the entire span of all of this until about here, the only thing that we use for energy source is biomass. Literally the mass of biology. So that could be whale fat that was burned for lamps for a very, a very short period of time, or wood. Wood, leaves, all of that stuff. Anything you could get from a forest. Cow dung, right? That's what we've been using for energy for fueling our agricultural revolution for the last 10,000 years after we forgot all these other things that we were doing, right? Which was not using a lot of energy, biomass, things like that. Now here, then, we enter a brand new source of energy material. That's coal, a hard rock that can be burned. And then not very long after that, we have the discovery of oil, liquid fuel. And the discovery of oil, as you can see, is pretty much the underpinning, in tandem with agriculture, is pretty much the underpinning, the underpinning, what am I looking for? The underpinning one factor, let's call it a factor. The one factor that led to this major rise in population over the billions in the last 20 years. I mean, look at this. Our population has never been a billion until the oil age, right? I think in the maybe in the very, very late 1800s, we might have gotten to 1 billion. I should go back and look at those numbers if they're not written in here somewhere. So welcome to the Anthropocene, right? Yeah, welcome to the Anthropocene. That is one of the things that exclusively typifies the Anthropocene, is that humans are everywhere, all over the earth, and we're all doing the same thing. So there was a spread of agriculture during the pre-boreal period. This is the Holocene that's split into multiple different subsets of the Holocene, mostly based on the appearance of human artifacts around the world, or human cultures around the world. And this style, right, this is relatively modern, of course, but the plow, the steel plow, and the horses, of doing agriculture. But that's essentially what we've been doing for 10,000 years. And along with that comes, as I told you with the John Day soils, paleopathology, soils really tell us about an environment, right? And looking at the soils through history or through the Holocene really tells us something about our own history. And it turns out a lot of those soils over the last 10,000 years have been depleted or solely erased or eroded away because of intense agriculture. For instance, the hills of Greece apparently used to be very wooded. Those were used for fuel, and the valleys used to be very fertile soils. The soil is all bare and is down to nearly bedrock. This is from the book, I think it's called Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations, not Michael Pollan, David Montgomery. Anyway, it really talks a lot about the relationship between soils and population, because soils is the source of agriculture, right? We have to grow plants in the soil, not out of the toilet, right? You know what I mean? I never seen no plants grow out of no toilet. We have to grow them out of soil with water, mind you, not Gatorade or Brondo. Then another interesting, of course, this is a whole smattering, a whole collage of Anthropocene-type ideas. I really, as a geologist, I gravitate towards this style of disturbance that's a very, that's very exclusive to our time period very recently, is to do really large mining operations. And I'm not talking about Iron Age mines that may have been used to make the original plows and things like this, but I'm talking about gigantic geomorphic disturbance around 100 square kilometers of area. And then also we have the highway and the road system that is transporting goods and services and people all over the world, or you have interstate highways systems like we have in the United States that connects all of the major human dwelling areas, which I think is really cool and interesting. We have electricity, right? During the rise of electricity, that certainly impacted overall our population, the ability to refrigerate, so lower infant mortality, lower mortality all the way around. We can stay up later at night and read books or to get more work done. So we become more productive and overall more industrial. So electricity has also played its part in this rise of our population in combination with agriculture 10,000 years ago. So we have electricity that's lighting up the entire world here. And then, of course, one of the things that really fairly exclusively goes along with our time period since World War II, after the rise of plastics in the environment. We use plastic for everything, every container, every moldable form we need to. We have a type of plastic that we can use for that. They're incredibly versatile. In a bit, or I think next lecture, we'll talk a little bit about oil and its versatility. And plastics is one of those that we use and then we dispose of. And then we dispose of, right? Then we get rid of that plastic and it fills up landfills and it doesn't decompose, as we well know. It takes thousands of years, right, for many types of plastics, and they're considered contaminants in the environment. Yesterday I read a harrowing article about a whale that was found dead off of the coast of, I think, in the Philippines. I should go back to look at the article. That detail I can't remember, but had pounds of plastic in its gut and microplastics from being in the environment of the ocean, which is getting more and more full of plastics as we speak. So plastics are oftentimes thought of all of these things to be one of the longest lasting impacts that we have, especially when we put them in giant pits like this. We're essentially making a fossil of our presence here at this time. So if there's one thing that really creates a Anthropocene style of fossil, it would be the plastics or the plasticlomerate. And I'll come back to this one here in just a couple of seconds, and also to the plastics. Now, what I reviewed there a couple of minutes ago, this is common, this style of curve, the way that this is shown. I think sometimes we're desensitized to it because we see this style of graph all the time. But I just wanted to point out the paper here in the Anthropocene Review, the trajectory of the Anthropocene and the Great Acceleration. That's the name that's given to this last 50-ish or so years. They put the marker right at 1950, nice round number, that a whole bunch of measurable processes and environmental processes, we can see a huge curve starting in 1950. So tropical forest loss increases sharply. I mean, we have quite a bit of loss before that as we're using for fuel for our rising population from the 1800s. Domesticated land, shrimp aquaculture, surface temperatures, nitrous oxides in the environment, in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, methane in the atmosphere, ocean acidification, stratospheric ozone, all of these environmental Earth systems trends, on their way up. Maybe even some of those barely measurable before, right? With such this is a fairly low pH. It's more of a basic pH. Then over here to socioeconomic trends. So many of these things are basically because of our, trying to sustain and grow our human population. So supporting industries and businesses and production and manufacturing, and supporting just how we do what we do as humans. Foreign direct investment, increases a lot in the last couple of decades. Fertilizer consumption, so we can keep growing more and more crops. Real GDP, population, urban population, water use, paper production, right, skyrockets. And of course, more recently with the internet age, we're maybe decreasing some of that. Anyway, point here is that the same trends in our sometimes maybe our virtuous qualities of overall a higher GDP and higher population and being able to use energy for everybody go hand in hand with these environmental system trends that we're finding are devastating ecologically to areas, like say ocean acidification. I believe that we read about a mass extinction where ocean acidification was one of the potential contenders for mass extinction. Oh my gosh, did I just invoke the most terrible thing? I did. I compared one of these factors today that we are seeing to one of the big 5 mass extinctions. Now I don't mean to do that right now exactly, but I did allude to several slides ago that it has been discussed that the modern Holocene extinction can set the stage for what we could call in geology a mass extinction. But who would be around geologically to talk about it that way, right? So we don't call it a mass extinction because we're in the middle of it. We only call things mass extinctions when they happened, when we can quantify what species are around, what species are not, and how long it occurred, and the major 5 factors. All right, now last couple of bits here about the Anthropocene. Now that we're thick into this, here's a couple of papers I'll make sure are openly available on the Canvas website. The Anthropocene is functionally and stratigraphically distinct from the Holocene. So the Holocene is what we are classically in. Geologically, that's actually still what we call today as the Holocene, even though over the last decade, many people are beginning to not only use the word Anthropocene, but to apply that in our work in geologically. That is a beautiful sound wave, honey. And what's important here is that is stratigraphically, so the rocks that are being deposited during the Anthropocene look different from the rocks that are being deposited during earlier time periods in the Holocene. So what that means is, for instance, one, there's more plastics, right? Microplastics that are in the oceans that are there. The animals that are fossilizing, the communities of animals look different. So one of the discussions is, say, chickens, the rise of the chicken as an animal, and the bones, the potential for preservation. You know, it's pretty low at any given time, but if you increase the number of those species, then you have more and more chickens that are deposited or fossilized through time. So chickens could be a record of one of these stratigraphical changes, and I'll show you one more in just a second. When did the Anthropocene begin is also a question that we have, and it is argued here that a mid-20th century boundary level is stratigraphically optimal. So that 1950 line that was drawn a minute ago is pretty accurate, and is actually from all of these same authors, the Anthropocene Working Group, that is trying to understand and quantify why the Anthropocene is different from the Holocene and why we should call it so. Okay, so going back to this picture, I want to then, after that, discussing that last paper for a second, that a boundary needs to be known. In geology, we call these things golden spikes that are driven, literally driven into the type section of rock that show where the Cretaceous ends and the Paleogene begins, right? Or, for instance, in this case, where the Holocene ends and the Anthropocene begins. That's a golden spike, and then there's also, I think it's proverbially called a golden marker, on what are we looking for the transition between the Holocene to the Anthropocene. So chickens could be one of those fossils, plastics could be one of those fossils, but those things, they may have a lag time. It's not like we don't have chickens before and then we have chickens after. Where clearly during the Mesozoic, end Mesozoic extinction event, there are ammonites and then there are no ammonites. There are dinosaurs and then there are no dinosaurs. So it's actually preferable to try to stratigraphically measure and observe something that is not there before and is there now, or is there then and not there now. You know what I mean? We're trying to find, there has to be something definitive. So timing-wise, we're looking at all of those rises, all the kind of hockey stick curves, the great acceleration is why the about 1950s are chosen. But if we look at events, clearly the atomic testing, or actually the Trinity experiment, July 16th, 1945, the very first atomic device, atomic weapon, bomb, made and of course this was done for decades afterwards in testing. So, but this one being the first is the original marker. And now, why would that have an effect, and why would that be something that we couldn't measure then, but we can measure afterwards? Why is it that marker? Well, here's why: is carbon dioxide, or the carbon part of that dioxide molecule in the atmosphere, can have two different types of carbon that have different isotope levels, or they have a different number of neutrons associated with them. You can have, I think there's actually 3, carbon 12, 13, and 14. I think that carbon 12 and 14 are the two important ones, and 13 maybe only has a short amount of time before it decays into 12. And those amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, or carbon, are of course ratios according to how much actual or all amounts of carbon dioxide there is. Now, what was interesting about this bomb is when it blew up, all these neutrons went scattering out there. This is radiation. All these particles get scattered out there with a lot of energy, and they were able to knock off a carbon, or let's see, or maybe add a neutron to some of these carbon atoms, because these things have a lot of energy. And so a fusion reaction occurs to some of these carbons and makes some of those carbon 14s into nitrogen 14s. So there is not like a transmutation in alchemy, but literally one element 1 minute before this was carbon, and then after this turned into nitrogen. So the balance on the amount of carbon to nitrogen, or even C14 to C12 that was in the atmosphere before this, is inherently different than after this. And then we did this repeatedly for decades. Now that is a chemical signature, because as well, why does carbon dating work for you and I? Because we eat plants that absorbed carbon dioxide to become part of their structure, and then we eat their structure, and we are now made of their carbon. So we are made of carbon that's originally in the atmosphere, and when that ratio changed, all of a sudden, there's a new ratio in the atmosphere that's imbued in every plant, that's imbued in every one of us, especially those people who went through this time period, or especially those rocks that were deposited during this time period, or the waters that were also precipitating minerals during that time. So I think this is really fascinating that we actually have a very good, the timing is right, marker, but we also have a chemical marker to use as the onset of the Anthropocene. So that's how you could chemically measure it, but how could you actually visually, if you were a geologist in 20 million years from now, how could you tell the Anthropocene? You could probably tell by the rise of plastics. And this was the very first article of naming a new stone that has plastics within it. This is called the plastiglomerate, an anthropogenic marker horizon in the future rock record. And in the abstract here, they say, here we report the appearance of a new stone formed through intermingling of melted plastic, beach sediment, and basaltic lava fragments, and then maybe some organic debris from Camilo Beach on the island of Hawaii. The material herein, referred to as plastiglomerate, is divided into in situ type deposits or clastic type deposits that were distributed over all areas of the beach. So an in situ type would be those that the plastic actually melted along with the basalt and mingled into the lava flow with some of the local sediments. That is a type, and then there's also these plastics and sands and lava fragments, lava sands, that are made into kind of a sedimentary, or a weakly cemented sedimentary rock, but they are a rock. And this is something we would call a conglomerate that's poorly sorted between large particles and small particles. So they just applied the word plastic in the conglomerate. I think this is really, it's harrowing in some ways, right? Clearly the amounts of plastics and knowing the degradation amount and these things, but that's not the part that I'm trying to dwell on right now, right? And I don't want you to see it in that way either. What I'm really trying to do here, again, like this entire course, is to give you details. So this isn't just a discussion of like plastics are bad, right? Plastics, are in the ocean. But I want you to have details on how we as geologists might think about this, or Earth system scientists, or the way that we think about plastics integrating into our overall timeline of who we are and what we're doing. And even how important that is into the discussion we're having now about the Anthropocene, or the time where humans are a geologic agent. Plastics are a big part of us, of our geologic agency. All right, so last couple of slides here, and this is a transition into the next lecture that I should do. I don't always do that, and it's not part of the course, but the sixth mass extinction. So I'll go to that. We'll say something about that, and I want to remind you that opportunities for other organisms come from the mass extinctions of animals before. As we saw during the Cretaceous-Paleogene mass extinction, is that fungi bloomed, so maybe we are actually terraforming the earth for fungi. And here's why. George Carlin, great comedian, pretty offensive and pretty rash in some things, but his humor is quite interesting. And he made a statement once in a kind of an environmental focused, or kind of it was an environmentalist attacking comedy skit, just interesting for me to like it. And he actually, he wondered this, he asked this question, talking to Earth, or sort of about religious philosophy, like, why are we here? Why? And he says the Earth then answers, to make plastics, right? So I found that, I latched on to that idea that he had sort of proposed in a joking way that maybe our purpose here on this planet is to make plastics, okay? And now I should have said this when I transferred the slide, but I'm really speculating here. This is future stuff we're talking about, and I'm bringing in a comedian as a reference, okay? This is more joking than it is any amounts of science that we've talked about in this class, right? All I'm doing is taking a few things and stitching them together as far as speculation goes. Now then, Terence McKenna, sort of a famous psychonaut or an ethnobotanist, he is also famous for a hypothesis suggesting that fungi, varieties of types of fungi, actually take advantage of human evolution. And this has also been proposed by other food authors in ways that the plants are actually, in some ways, the ones that are in control of the animals, because they don't have any legs, but they sure do taste good. So we end up transferring them around the world because of these qualities that they taste good or they look pretty, right? So we have taken plants, and fungi being one of those, around the world, and we are doing the plant's bidding or the fungi bidding. It's quite a bit deeper than that, but I'll leave that to your own. So fungi takes advantage of human evolution. Maybe it's been in control this whole time, and we are just making plastics so the fungi can decompose it. In 2012, there was a group from Yale that were trying to cultivate a mycology group from Yale that were trying to culture all these different Amazonian rainforest fungi in petri dishes. They had plastic petri dishes, and one of these cultures wasn't growing very well until it got to the edge of the petri dish, and then it started growing around the petri dish and actually decaying and eating the plastic petri dish. And they published articles on this. This was the pioneering article, and since there's been more, biodegradation of polyester, polyurethane by endophytic fungi. Fungi have the ability and the enzymes to break down certain plastics, and they're not alone. This one fungi of the Amazon are not alone. We've known for decades that oyster mushrooms, they're kind of common. You can buy them in the store, actually. They have the ability to break down hydrocarbons like oil.